Hello, my name is Lester Bruce Hunt. I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today's date is Wednesday, the 2nd of November, 2022. And I'm here with Vietnam veteran Al Linden. Thank you for doing this with us.
You're welcome.
Yeah, let's get to the questions. So my first question is, why and when did you decide to join the Army?
It was ROTC at the University of Illinois, and as a result of that, I became a regular Army officer,
Okay.
and that obligated me to 3 years.
How did you earn your Purple Heart, and how was your rehab and return to active duty?
I earned. I was flying armed and combat helicopters, gunships, and we were flying missions. And on a particular mission, we received enemy heavy machine gun enemy ground fire, and it came. The bullet came through the door and took my leg, lower right leg off.
Okay. Can you talk more about your service as a airborne ranger, the 121st Aviation Company?
Yes, the mission of the 121st Aviation Company was to support the 44th Arvin Ranger Battalion. At the time, known Cal Key, who later became the Prime Minister, was the battalion commander, and their mission was basically to seek out and destroy the enemy, which was mainly in the woods in the lower part of the Mekong Delta.
How did you gain the rank of major?
Through promotion. I was a regular Army officer, and it was through promotions, and as a result of having commands in Europe and platoon leader of the 121st Aviation Company, I was promoted to major. And it was early in my career. It was early in my career, and I was below the zone in terms of being promoted to major.
Can you talk about your service after you attained major? Go into more detail.
Yes, I came back to Walter Reed. Was rehabbed, and the orthopedic surgeon who did the rehab suggested that, asked me if I wanted to fly again, and he was also a flight surgeon in the Army, and I said sure. So when I got out of Walter Reed, they sent me down back to Fort Rucker, and I flew every airplane and helicopter that I was qualified to fly, and I passed all the tests, and they returned me to flying status. And I went to the Army Materiel Command, where I was a pilot for the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and flew.
They let you fly after you lost your leg?
Yes, I was the first Army pilot with the loss of one leg to return to flying status.
Can you go into more detail about the kinds of missions you were on and what you did there?
Yes, in Vietnam, the first couple of months I was there, I flew what they call the slicks, or the troop carrier helicopters, which took the Vietnamese soldiers into battle. Then I had gone to the first gunship school when I was at before I went to Vietnam, and so then after a couple of months of flying slicks, I became platoon leader for the gunships, and I flew the Seamal Huey gunships at the time.
Wow.
And we were out every day supporting the South Vietnamese, the ARVNs, in the 44th, which was the 44th Ranger Battalion, on their combat missions. And we provide support.
Can you talk about the combat missions you were involved in?
Well, the combat missions that we were involved in involved trying to clear the North Vietnamese out of the woods, and a lot of it was providing the air support, and they were well entrenched, and they had like I say, heavy-duty machine guns that kept shooting at us while we were supporting the combat missions of the South Vietnamese, and it was a Ranger Battalion. And on occasion, when I had a day off from flying, I would go out with the Ranger Battalion, because I was a Ranger and they knew it. And but that was just on several occasions that I do that.
Okay. Can you talk about what, if I'm not mistaken, the South Vietnamese were with you?
Yes, they were. The 121st Aviation Company would fly them into combat situations, landing strips. We would support that, and we would then stay there and provide air support with our gunships for the Vietnamese when they were when the ARVNs were doing their mission. And so that's when I got shot, was when I was flying that day. That we also always had two pilots on board, so.
Okay. Can you talk more about the story of when you got shot?
Well, basically when I got shot, the bullet came through the door. We were in a steep turn, and the bullet came through, glanced off. They had in those days, they were, the armament was very good. There was just a piece of metal across the door, and the bullet actually, when we were in a steep turn, split the bullet in two, and that's what got my leg.
Oh.
And then we were able to, in the middle of the fight, set the helicopter down. Dust off came in, and dust off was the medevac helicopter. It picked me up, but during that time, one of the medics got shot in the arm, and he dropped me in the rice. He let go and dropped me in the rice paddy, but he was able to recover, and they got me into the medevac dust off helicopter, and they flew me to Saigon, where they did a surgery on my leg. But it was gone. It took all the vital, the arteries, the nerves, and the bone. Was basically, since it was tumbling, it was a pretty clean shot. I mean, and I was also in an oxygen tent for, I don't know, maybe a week, because I had a pulmonary emboli that lodged in my lung, and therefore I was short of breath, which today I still have problems with shortness of breath, but not significant. I still could function. And when I first entered the service, I went to the basic artillery course. Then I went to airborne ranger school, and then flight school, and served in Europe for about 2.5 years, of which better than a year of that was I commanded an artillery 155 howitzer artillery battery. As a lieutenant, and then as a captain.
Right.
I've at the Army Materiel Command. Like I say, I went. We had missions to fly people to all the Army depots across the United States. I became multi-engine qualified because we had a C-45 that it was the only one the Army had at the time to fly people, and so we flew the commanding general and others around the country to the Army depots. After serving several years there, they would send me back to Vietnam because of my leg, but they wanted to send me. That was when you spent a year in Vietnam and 6 months in the States as a pilot, because they were short of pilots. They wanted to send me to Korea, and as a regular to get a hardship tour, and so I then took a medical retirement instead of going to Korea.
What's a medical returnment?
Retirement, yeah.
Retirement, okay.
Retirement, yeah. And, but from there, I then went to work in Washington, D.C. for a period of time, and I moved to Florida and became the adjutant for the state of Florida DAV, and I spent 30 years doing that. And then I retired from that, and I'm still a service officer for the DAV during my time as the adjutant. I also did service work, and so that's what I do now is service work, and then I also which is volunteer, and I also volunteer for a day a week for the VA in the prosthetics department.
Can you talk about any experience in combat?
Well, my experience in combat was fairly short because I was only there for 4 months, but we flew every day. Multi missions with the carrying the ARVN into battle.
What is an ARVN?
ARVN, it was the 44th members of the 44th Ranger Battalion of the Vietnamese. ARVN was the term we used as if you were a Vietnamese soldier, you were an ARVN.
Okay.
And that was supposedly an elite. It was an elite outfit of the Vietnamese Army because it was a 44th Ranger Battalion. And as I said earlier, knowing Cao Ki, when I got there, was the commander of the battalion, who later became the prime minister, and then Big Ben followed him, and Big Ben eventually became the prime minister after knowing Cao Ki went on to other things. So it had a pretty significant background in terms of the people who commanded the Ranger Battalion, and they were probably the elite of the Vietnamese Army. They were all good
Americans
soldiers.
training them?
Yes.
How did that work?
Each unit had either one or two Army officers that trained them and went to combat with them, as well as normally there was an enlisted man from our armed forces that went with them. But they went to school before they came to the unit. They were trained, and they were pretty good soldiers. I mean, they did their job. And most of this was before there were any American ground forces there.
Wow.
This was in the 1967, 68 time frame, so.
You talk about how the DAV was founded and why you decided to join.
The DAV was founded in 1921 by General Marks, who is since long deceased. But when I was at Walter Reed in rehab, they had the DAV members from New York would come down and visit the hospitals, and they gave you for a year a free membership in the DAV. And so then I became active in the DAV in the state of Maryland, and I was the commander of the DAV in Maryland in the 80s for a year, and then I was also the treasurer there. So I been active in the DAV ever since then, and in 1985 85, 86, I was the national commander of the DAV.
Can you talk about your induction into the Veterans Hall of Fame?
Yes, I was one of the earlier classes that they inducted into the Veterans Hall of Fame, and the governor invited us to the mansion, to the governor's mansion, and he's now our U.S. senator, but he was then the governor of Florida, and he invited us there. The procedure was that you were nominated by somebody locally, and then they had a review committee, and they selected certain people to be in the Veterans Hall of Fame, and that was a honor for me to be selected to that. And part of the during this part of the selection process is also what had you done as a veteran after you'd been in the service.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, it was your entire span of time that you were active, but mainly what had you done to help veterans after you'd gotten out of the service? And I'd always been very active in that regard.
Can you talk about the different vehicles you flew and how effective one was versus the others?
Yeah, I can. I flew early. I flew in my Army career. I flew single engine L-19s, L-20s, which were then mainly what the Army had to go. Then I went and volunteered. When I came back, I volunteered to go from Europe. I went to the advanced artillery class, and then I was assigned back to the Army Material. I was assigned to the Army Materiel Command, and they had multi-engine airplanes, and I became multi-engine qualified, and then also an instructor pilot in C-45. But I flew most all the H-30. In those days, they had H-34 helicopters. I was qualified in that. I was qualified in the Huey, all the Huey models, to fly, as well as the fixed wing airplanes that the Army had, and most of my time in flying, other than in combat, was, flying people around, and also flying, being artillery. In the artillery, I flew the people who would pick out the targets for the artillery to be shooting at. So, and that was in the L-19. I was in the back seat doing that, and I would fly them around doing that. So I had a pretty extensive career in flying in the short time that I was in the service.
What do you think that maybe young people who aren't really familiar with the Vietnam War, what do they need to know?
Well, I think they need to know that there were a lot of people who went to Vietnam who were very dedicated to this country, who were also wanted to make sure that this country wasn't overrun or this country wasn't, involved directly on the home front here in the U.S., and that it wasn't then, it was not an all volunteer. There were draftees as well as people who had volunteered to go to join the Army. So it was a good mixture of people. They were dedicated to their job, and they were good soldiers. Didn't have near the problems that the U.S. and the younger generation face today.
Did you ever go into the countries adjacent to Vietnam for the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Did you ever go off into that direction, or were you pretty much fixed in Vietnam?
Legally, we were fixed in Vietnam. What we did, being that we were when I was gunships, if the North Vietnamese would flee to Cambodia, we would cross the line, and we didn't know where the border was. And would do it because they would try to flee back to there and flee to Cambodia. And so, especially when we were working close to what was the border. But, in the air you can't tell exactly where the border is. We would, at times, I'm pretty sure we were in Cambodia doing our job. But the enemy had led us there. So
Okay.
And I will say that I did plan on making the Army a career. I probably still could, I got back on flying status. I could have continued, but I wanted to get my master's degree, and that's what I did. The reason I got out.
What was your degree in?
My undergraduate degree was in dairy technology, where you learn how to make ice cream and milk and all that good stuff. I have an MBA, Master of Business Administration, and it was in computers and management, and that was at American University, and that was like 10 years later.
Yep. So what were you involved doing? We've discussed the sort of the earlier part of your career. What about towards the end of the war? What were you doing during that time, like early 70s?
Well, I got out in 77, and then I went to work for then it was called the Bureau of the Budget. Mm-hmm. It was it was next door to the White House. It was in the old executive office building in there, and we supported basically in that job, we did the policy for like computers and what you could do with computers in the federal government. And I helped install the White House computers and the systems that they used.
What kind of computers were these back then?
Well, I don't know. They had similar capabilities, but not as extensive as the ones that we have today. But I mean,
Right.
you could we built models with them and things of that nature. I was in the Energy Information Administration, where I was the deputy director for a period of time, and there we collected all the information on any kind of energy, the price of gas, the price of coal, how much coal we had, how much the reserves that we had of all of our energy resources. I had 3,000 people that were involved in doing that. Some of them were stationed in Texas and Oklahoma and places like that where the resources were, where they would go out and work with the oil companies and the coal companies to determine how much reserves the country had. And that was I enjoyed that work there. But all that was after I was shot.
Okay.
Here.
Well, what made you decide to pick the Army over other branches of service?
Well, it was the ROTC, the Army. We at the University of Illinois, where I graduated, we had Naval ROTC and had Army. But I had when I was 16, I was dating my wife, and next door to my wife lived the reserve, Army Reserve captain, and as soon as he got me into the Army Reserves.
Okay.
While I was still in high school.
Wow.
So that was a logical, and I enjoyed doing that. And then when I went to the University of Illinois, I joined the ROTC and advanced ROTC, and I got my regular Army commission when I graduated from there. Next day, I was in the Army at Fort Riley, Kansas, as a second lieutenant.
Wow.
So I had 3 or 4 years experience as an enlisted man, and then I became, in the reserves, and then I went to college and still stayed in the reserves there. And then when I got commissioned, I had 3 or 4 years of time, so that put me in a higher pay grade.
Right.
But I had a younger brother who enlisted in the Navy, and my other brother was in the reserves. But in Illinois, but that was after I
Right.
had made, so all three of it. And my dad never was in the service.
Okay. I'm out of questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I enjoyed my time in the service, even though I wasn't too good at dodging bullets. Uh, and I've, you know, kind of dedicated my life to helping veterans, and I'm still doing that at the age of 84, helping them get their claims, assisting them and getting their claims for compensation, and I enjoy that, and I enjoy helping people,
It's good.
and it's been a good experience.
One last question. Were you involved with training South Vietnamese soldiers? And what was
No, no, not really.
was it a challenge to get them trained? Do you know?
No, they like I say, the 44th Ranger Battalion was an elite outfit in in the Vietnamese Army. I mean,
Okay.
and it had, like I say, both of the commanders that I were there later became prime ministers. So, you know, of Vietnam, South Vietnam. So they were the best of the best that they had. The Vietnamese had, and then, you know, they were like any soldiers. They needed leadership, and they had leadership. They had good leadership. I mean,
Oh, yeah, I wasn't aware they were the way you described them.
yeah. I mean, I'm sure they were the elite, if you will. They had to go through extensive training that was before they went to this battalion,
Okay.
and so they knew what their jobs were. But they were like any soldier. Sometimes, you know, they'd get in trouble, but they were much more regimented than the U.S. Army. For example, if they would be in waiting on the ground in our compound. That's where we flew them off of most of the time, was in our airfield there. And, you know, if they goofed off or something, the sergeants would think nothing of hitting them on the head with a rifle. But, you know, they were well. They were much more, I would say, more disciplined than you know, in different ways than the American soldiers. And the American soldiers were good, but these also did their job
I have
and did it well.
I have to ask now, when you talk about the best of the best in South Vietnam, what is your opinion on the at the time the issue of Vietnamization? Did you think that was practical, or what would you say was wrong with it?
I we didn't get much into it, but the people and you know, we had people that would work in our compound, do, you know, wash our clothes and keep the barracks up and all that good stuff. And they you know, they did their job.
Right.
And you know, a lot of them didn't speak. Most of them didn't speak a whole lot of English, but
Right.
they understood when you said, you know, do this or do that. They would do it. I mean, so, and we didn't have any real trouble. There was no trouble within the compound, and we were isolated. I mean, we were there by ourselves basically.
Yeah.
And we were as far south as any Americans went.
Huh.
And so we had to rely on them for, you know, basically security and things of that nature. Now, we had a few Army people there that were security, but not that many. I mean, you know, maybe no more than, say, 8 or 9 at a time, you know. So they relied on the Vietnamese too to make sure the compound was safe.
Okay.
And we would get mortared. They would take, in those days, before we got there were H-21s. I don't know. H-21 had these long struts. It was a predecessor to the Chinook.
Okay.
But if one of those got shot down, they would take the struts off of those, and somehow they'd get a hold of, not at our compound, but outside of our compound, they would get a hold of 3.5 rocket launchers, rockets, which we had in 6 on each side in a pod that we fired, but they would lob them back at us with those. So the compound would periodically get would have that fire, but it wasn't using our ammo. It was ammunition they got from somewhere else. They didn't get it from us there.
Okay.
But yeah, we'd get shelled probably every other night or so, and we slept basically with sandbags all around us. You know.
Now, what area was this?
South Vietnam, the delta, what they called the Mekong Delta, but it was the southernmost part of Vietnam.
Okay.
And it was, the other mission that we had was if like a Air Force or Navy pilot or ship would get shot down and they would bail out in South Vietnam, and we have to go pick them up because you know, the airplane was falling apart on their part. So we did quite a bit of that too, as well as that. But no, the Vietnamese soldiers that were in the Ranger Battalion, you know, they were good. They were well disciplined and they did their job. And I can't speak for any of the rest of the Vietnam Army or anything of that nature, but they had probably the best of the sergeants and lieutenants and all that good stuff. And they didn't put up with any crap. I mean, literally they didn't. But I can't complain because I volunteered to go. But that was kind of thing as an Army, especially like when I was at the basic and advanced courses, the other ones were all West Point graduates. I mean, most of them were West Point graduates, or at least half of the class
Wow.
were West Point graduates. And so that's who you competed with if you wanted to, if you wanted to stay in the service, that would be your competition.
Wow.
And so I was normally at the top of my classes, and be for that reason. I didn't want to be second. And so I studied hard and did what I had to do, and like I say, I got promoted to major below the zone with the early, a little early, but I'd had the right experiences too. The command artillery battery in Europe and things of that nature. But no, the Army, I would say, and I can only speak about the Army, I can't speak about the Navy or any of those, but the Army taught you leadership, taught you discipline, and I saw a lot of that from the NCOs and the people coming up the line.
Yeah.
Most of them wanted to get ahead, and would do it. You always had to give Article 15s for people that didn't want to toe the line. But one of the things that I had that made it easy on me when I was in Europe, I had a first sergeant who was been airborne ranger, was my first sergeant, and my chief of firing battery was a colored guy, sergeant, and he was outstanding. He was one of the best on a then they had pro pay test. I don't know if they still do, but test. He'd score the highest. But he didn't mess around. He didn't mess around because in the troops liked him because he was strict, but he was fair.
Right.
And they respected that, and he knew what he was doing. I mean, he was he was sharp. I mean, he knew what he was doing. And they respected them because I had a guy who, a private who was a soldier who, that's using the term, he was a misfit really, but he was always doing little things, getting in trouble, and he didn't like the Army, didn't like this, didn't like that. And he was a black guy. And he fell out of the we had multiple story buildings, 2-story buildings in Europe, and the concerns for the troops stayed. Where they lived, and most of them lived on base. And he fell out of the he hurt himself. He fell out of the 2nd-story window.
Wow.
He didn't fall out of got the shit beat out of him. But then he went and complained to the first sergeant and the chief of firing battery and said that I was prejudiced against him.
Oh, jeez.
And let me tell you, that chief of firing battery, who I remember is black, took this guy out. I didn't see it, but this is what the first sergeant told me, and just banged his head against the wall, the side of the building, and he said, "The Captain Linden is not prejudiced, and you better get that through your head." I mean, so he he didn't take any, and that was a story that went around through that whole thing, and I didn't have any trouble. You know, I really didn't have any trouble with the whole time I was commander there. I mean, after that, they they towed the line. They knew. And the first sergeant was like an old airborne ranger guy, a little short guy, carried a swagger stick, and I mean, he didn't waste. He, you know, been around for a long time, so I lucked out. I had good leadership, you know, at the enlisted level. So, but and I'd help them, because when we came back, we had firing. Every year we'd have to go to Grafenwehr, which was where we shot. We were a 155 self-propelled howitzer battalion or company, actually a battery they called, and we'd have 6 pieces and 6 weapons, and there'd be a crew of about 10, maybe 8 or 10 on each gun. And you know, you had your cooks and your mechanics and you know that, but we tested the top. Yeah, our company was, or our battery was the top battery in the live fire drills when we were in Grafenwehr. And so the general, the 1-star general, who was a character, he carried a swagger stick also. He was the artillery for the Corps. And I'd flown him around. And so he knew who I was. He knew me. Because we had one incident where when I was a lieutenant, and see, I was in the first class that gave instrument tickets for flying. You could fly in bad weather, and so I had an instrument ticket. Not many of the pilots in Europe had instrument tickets, and so every time the weather was a little bad, or the generals or the colonel wanted to go somewhere, I was the pilot in command. Well, I had a black captain who thought a shit didn't stink. You know, no, I mean he you know, he was above the, you know, and we were going into Grafenwehr one day, and he grabbed the control. I was the pilot in command because I had the instrument ticket, okay, and I'd shot 2 missed approaches because the weather was bad. I mean, it was, you know, you couldn't find the runway. And we were flying instruments, and so he grabbed them, and he grabbed a hold of the controls when we were coming down, and I whacked one over, and I hit him. I went, it's like, get off the controls, you know. And the general was sitting in the back seat, and the colonel was sitting in the back seat, and he was going to get me court-martialed, and they all knew. I said, well, you know, I'm the pilot in command. I'm the one that had the sight and flight plan. You know, I'm the one who's instrument qualified here. And General says, son, don't you worry. Because he knew, you know, he knew me and knew I was straight guy, you know, wasn't a problem.
Right.
But see, I was young enough then that I could fly the airplane in bad weather myself. But don't mess with me. Don't add any additional things, because I hadn't been flying for 20 years in bad weather. I mean, you know.
Wow.
And so that was the only way I could get him off the damn controls. So he tried to write me a bad efficiency report and didn't go anywhere, because the colonel who I worked directly for said, don't worry, I have to sign off on your report. And he said he had a letter from the general that said that was a good guy too, So I didn't have to worry. But for a while there, I was a little worried. But this guy he thought he was hot shit, because he was probably in those days was more elite in terms of blacks flying airplanes and helicopters and stuff like that. In other words, there weren't that many that were doing it then. In fact, he probably was the only one I knew in Europe that was a colored aviator, a black aviator. And, he thought his shit didn't. But he got kind of, so I lucked out there, And that was before it was on ground duty. So it was between the general and the colonel that decided that I ought to go on ground duty and be in that battalion and run that battery. So.
What was that like?
Huh? Oh, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Because I had a good first sergeant and a good chief of fire and battery, and it was a good outfit. I mean, I didn't have hardly any trouble. And I do PT every day with the troops in the morning, and then I weighed 125 pounds and was in good shape. I mean, I could outdo them, and I would tell them, I said, "You guys think you can do more push-ups or do more sit-ups than I can? Have at it." But because they saw me every day and they knew, and no one would challenge me. But I was always there, and so they appreciated. I think they appreciated that because they said, "Well, you're the only lieutenant, then captain, that ever did PT with us." And I said, "Yep." I said, "I don't expect you to do anything that I can't do." And so I had good good relationship with them. And I didn't have too many Article 15s.
What's an Article 15?
That's company punishment.
Okay.
I mean, or battery punishment. I don't know what the Navy would call it, but unit punishment, And if you go any higher, special court martial and things of that nature. But no, I enjoyed the service, but when they wanted to send me to Korea and mess with me, I just said, I want to get my master's degree, which I did.
So when was it they tried to send you to Korea?
When I was in our materiel command, this was in probably I'd say the late 70s.
Okay.
19.
Okay.
But that was fair because all pilots, Army pilots, would spend a year in Vietnam and 6 months in the States. A year in Vietnam, 6 months in the States. That was the normal rotation. But since I hadn't been, they didn't want to send me back to Vietnam, and I didn't want to particularly go back. And I had to have a hardship tour. And it was funny because the guy that was managing my career in the Army was in the same flight school class that I was in. But he was just doing his job.
Right.
So I just got out, got my master's degree in
What'd you get your master's degree in?
computers and management. And I have an MBA.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, I've been very fortunate. I can't complain. You want that back?
Yeah, I think we're done
Then
now.
we're done. All right.
We've done a whole hour.
Okay.
Well, thank you for doing the interview.
Oh, no problem at all.
Appreciate it.
Glad to do it.